we took a field trip to see the George W. Bush Museum, and I know a couple of us in this room went as well. And that was just a great reminder of how much of an impact a president can make on the country. Now, the 37th president of the United States was Richard Nixon, and he did not make the best decisions as president. So today I'll be talking about what the Watergate scandal is, Nixon's resignation speech, and how the people responded to this speech. So first, let's take a look at what the Watergate scandal is. So from the Richard Nixon Foundation, the board of directors compiled a timeline of the presidency, and on June 17, 1972, several burglars went into the Democratic National Committee located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. They wiretapped phones and stole documents, and there was suspicions that Nixon was a part or were connected to these men. And Nixon gave a speech in the White House and said he swore he had nothing to do with this scandal. And so this is during the time of his re-election, and he ended up winning in a landslide. And so right after this happened, he began to send hush money to these burglars to keep it on the down low. And so rumors began to spread that Nixon was a part of this, and he was brought to the grand jury. So it was testified that Nixon recorded all of the conversations in the Oval Office. And so the grand jury needed to get these hands on these recordings to prove that he was guilty. So Nixon struggled to keep these recordings protected and these tapes protected. And he ended up surrendering some of them. And then in 1974, this is just when it all began to unravel. So now that you have an idea of what the Watergate scandal is, I'll talk about Nixon's resignation speech. So Nixon was forced to turn over these tapes from the Oval Office. And in the Watergate scandal article from History.com, it says, while the president dragged his feet, the House of Representatives the House of Representatives voted to impeach him for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and several violations of the Constitution. So he released all these tapes, and on August 8th, 1974, this is whenever he gave his resignation speech. And it started with, in all the decisions I've made in my public life, I've always tried to do what is best for the nation. And so just throughout the whole entire speech, he just stated several facts of what he did as president. He then briefly mentions the Watergate scandal that I just talked about by stating, throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term in which you have elected me. So he states this, but of course he really doesn't fulfill this commitment. And so I believe that Nixon was just not a trustworthy president or a person. And so he says, as president, I must put the interests of America first. And he states that a couple of times throughout his speech. But Nixon really doesn't express the illegal act he committed. Yet his main point of resigning is because of this. And so he just visualized himself as a good president and talks about his accomplishments. He thanks his friends and family for sticking by him during this hard period, during this difficult time. He never really takes full responsibility, but his words somewhat convey that just throughout the speech. And at the end, he says not to hold Ford, which is the vice president during this time, against his actions. So now that I've talked a little bit about the resignation speech, let's take a look at his legacy and people's responses to this. So Nixon believes that he left the world a better place after he resigned in a safer place. And the last part of the speech, he takes a deeper look at his hopes and his legacy from this. His last words were, to have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer, may God's grace be with you in all the days ahead. So Nixon really did want what was best for the country, but he didn't do it in the best way. And he even says in the speech, I would say that if some of my judgments were wrong and some were wrong, they were made in what I believed at the time to be best interest of the nation. So he uses this word if as though his decisions weren't necessarily wrong for the nation as a whole. So according to How the Watergate Crisis Eroded Public Support for Richard Nixon, an article by Andrew Cahoot, it explains that 71% of the nation watched his resignation speech and 21% watched the urban proceedings after this. So after all this happened, Nixon's ratings fell 31%, and the people started to understand that this was a huge deal that's been going on. And so even so much that this is why he is resigning. And so later people weren't so easy to or quick to forget and forgive him. They were hoping Ford would take action. And people wanted him to be sentenced with criminal charges if he was found guilty. And they wanted Ford to not pardon him for all of his wrongdoings. And Ford ended up pardoning Nixon and Ford lost his election in 1976. So in conclusion, I have talked about the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon's resignation speech, and how the people responded to this during the time. So Richard Nixon, he really did want what was best for the nation, but he did not present this or make the best decisions in acting out this what he wanted. And he left with this legacy of him just saying goodbye, and yet we still know Nixon today whenever we think of him, of the person who committed the scandal in the Watergate scandal.